ongoing. I now call the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'll make a statement on the Southport murders. None of us will ever forget the events of 29th of July. The school holidays had just started. Little girls were at a dance class to have fun, to dance, to sing. A moment of joy turned into the darkest of nightmares. And we think especially of three little girls, Elsie Dot Stankham, B.B. King, and Alice De Silva Aguiar. Their precious smiles and the dreams that their families had. And we think of their families' agony to have that future so brutally destroyed. They are in all our hearts and prayers, as are those who survived the attack but who live with the physical and emotional scars. And nothing will ever take away their trauma and loss, and we will ensure that they receive the support and care they need in the years to come. We think too of the police and first responders who ran into that scene of unspeakable horror. The courage they showed and the lives they saved is public service at its very best. Yesterday, Axel Rudakabana pled guilty to all charges. He stands responsible for one of the most barbaric crimes in our country's history. The most vile and cowardly attack on little children who could never defend themselves, carried out in the most horrific and traumatic way. The CPS has described him as a young man with a sickening and sustained interest in death and violence, who has shown no sign of remorse. On Thursday before sentencing, the prosecution will set out what happened that day and the nature of those offences. But, Mr. Speaker, now that the conviction has been secured, the families, the people of Southport and the entire country need answers about how this horrendous attack could ever have happened. The government has been constrained in what we could say up to this point about Rudakabana's past to avoid prejudicing any jury trial in line with all the normal rules of our British justice systems, because nothing was more important than securing justice. But now we can start to lay out that background. Multiple different agencies were in contact with Rudakabana and knew about his history of violence. He was referred 3 times to Prevent between December 2019 and April 2021, when aged 13 and 14. Between October 2019 and May 2022, Lancashire Police responded to 5 calls from his home address about his behaviour. He was referred repeatedly to the multi-agency safeguarding hub. He had contact with Children's Social Care, the Early Help Service, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. He was convicted of a violent assault against another child at school and was referred to the Youth Offending Team. He was excluded from one school. He had long periods of absence from another. All those agencies had contact with him. Yet between them, they completely failed to identify the terrible danger that he posed. How did he fall through so many gaps? It is just unbearable to think that something more could and should have been done. So there are grave questions about how this network of agencies failed to identify and act on the risks. There were so many signs of how dangerous he had become, yet the action against him was far too weak. So families need the truth about why the system failed to tackle his violence for so many years. That is why we are setting up an independent public inquiry. Like the Angelini inquiry into Wayne Couzens, it will begin work initially on a non-statutory basis so that it can move quickly into action, but with statutory powers added later as required. We will set out the terms of reference and appoint the chair once we have consulted the coroner and given the families the opportunity to comment. And in addition to examining what went wrong in this horrific case, I am also asking the inquiry to consider the wider challenge of rising youth violence and extremism. because I have been deeply disturbed at the number of cases involving teenagers drawn into extremism, serious violence and terrorism, including Islamist extremism, far-right extremism, mixed and confused ideology, and the obsession with violence and gore. There has been a threefold increase in under-18s investigated for involvement in terrorism in just 3 years. 162 people were referred to Prevent last year for concerns relating to school massacres. The Met Commissioner has warned about young men who are fixated on violence grazing across extremist and terrorist content online. And Five Eyes counter-terror partners have warned about growing radicalisation of minors, happening as so many of our children and teenagers are being exposed to ever more disturbing materials online, an online ecosystem that is radicalising our children while safety measures are whittled away. The Online Safety Act illegal content codes of practice come into force in March, and the child safety codes should be in place this summer. But companies should take responsibility before then. The prosecution will provide more detail on Thursday about material Rudakabana searched for online, but I can tell the House the government is this week contacting technology companies to ask them to remove dangerous material that he accessed. Companies should not be profiting from hosting content that puts children's lives at risk. And let me set out 4 other areas where we're taking action in advance of the inquiry. Firstly, on Prevent. The Government and Counter-Terrorism Policing jointly commissioned an immediate Prevent learning review during the summer, and I will publish detailed findings following the sentencing. The 3 referrals took place between 3 and 4 years before the Southport attack, including following evidence that he was expressing interest in school shootings, in the London Bridge attack, the IRA, MI5 and the Middle East. On each occasion, Rudakabana's case was assessed by Counter-Terrorism Policing, but in each case, there was no onward referral to specialist channel support. The learning review has concluded the referrals should not have been closed, and that cases such as these, given his age and complex needs, should be referred to channel. It concludes that too much weight was placed on the absence of ideology without considering the vulnerabilities to radicalisation or taking account of whether he was obsessed with massacre or extreme violence. And the cumulative significance of those 3 repeat referrals was not properly considered. Mr. Speaker, the Prevent programme is vital for our national security, and its officers work with huge dedication to keep us safe. But we need it to be effective. Some changes have already been made since 2021, including new Prevent duty guidance, new training for frontline workers on radicalisation, stronger policy on repeat referrals. And in September 2024, a new Prevent assessment framework was launched, supplemented by robust training for all Prevent police officers. But these changes do not go far enough. Given the importance of the programme, I cannot understand how it has been allowed to operate for so long without proper independent oversight. That is why I announced before Christmas the introduction of a new independent Prevent Commissioner with the power to review cases and to ensure that standards are being met. So I'm today appointing Lord David Anderson, KC, as an interim Prevent Commissioner to start work immediately, and his first task will be to conduct a thorough review of the Prevent history in this case to identify what changes are needed to make sure serious cases are not missed, particularly where there is mixed and unclear ideology. I've also tasked my department to conduct an end-to-end review of Prevent thresholds, including on Islamist extremism, where referrals have previously been too low. And we're looking at cases where mental ill health or neurodivergence is a factor and developing new arrangements with other agencies which may not meet the threshold for channel counter-extremism support, but where violent behaviour urgently must be addressed. Second, 2 shocking facts around knife crime emerged from this case. The Prevent Learning Review found that Rudakabana admitted to having carried a knife more than 10 times, yet the action against him was far too weak. And despite the fact that he'd been convicted for violence and was just 17, he was easily able to order a knife on Amazon. That's a total disgrace, and it must change. So we will bring in stronger measures to tackle knife sales online in the Crime and Policing Bill this spring. Mr. Speaker, thirdly, as the Prime Minister has set out this morning, we need to ensure our laws keep up with the changing violent and extremist threats we face. It is for the police and CPS to decide whether individual cases meet the definitions set out in the Terrorism Act 2000 when making charges. But given the growing number of cases where perpetrators are seeking to terrorise, even without a clear ideology, we need to ensure the law, powers and sentencing are strong enough to cope. I have therefore asked the independent reviewer on terrorism powers to examine the legislation in this area in the light of the modern threats we face. Finally, Mr. Speaker, let me address the issues of contempt of court. Because the British way of justice means information is presented to the court by the police and CPS with restrictions on what can be said beforehand, so the jury does not get partial or prejudicial information in advance to make sure that the trial is fair and justice is done. Social media puts those long-established rules under strain, especially where partial and inaccurate information appears online, and the Law Commission is reviewing the contempt of court rules in that light. But let me be clear, where the police, government and journalists are given clear advice from the CPS about contempt of court and about not publishing information in advance of a trial, if we did not respect that, and a killer walked free, we would never be forgiven. Mr. Speaker, there are times when something so unfathomably terrible happens that whatever words we find feel grossly insufficient. And that is how it feels over the Southport attack. So let there be no doubt. Responsibility for this outrage lies squarely with the perpetrator, but equally, in the wake of such a monstrous atrocity, we have to ask every question, no matter how difficult, and where change is needed, we must act. That is now our task. We owe that to the victims, to their loved ones, and we owe it to the country, because protecting the public is the first duty of the government and the shared purpose of this House. I commend this statement to the House.
Right, let us start and we'll get everybody in who was there on time. Can I come now to the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement and for the briefing which she very kindly arranged. Firstly, let us remember the 3 young, innocent victims of this savage and senseless attack. BB King was just 6 years old, Elsie Dot Stankham was 7, and Alice Da Silva Aguiar 9 years old. Their lives were cruelly cut short as they attended a Taylor Swift dance class. It should have been a time of joy, part of a precious and innocent childhood, to be cherished and remembered. And yet, the darkest of shadows fell over Southport that day as these girls were robbed of their young lives. Let us not forget that 8 more children and 2 adults were seriously injured on that day as well. Many of us in this House are parents or grandparents, and many people listening will be as well. We can only begin to imagine the pain and grief the parents and family of baby Elsie and Alice must now be feeling. And of course, we should recognise and thank the first responders who arrived on the scene. So, Mr. Speaker, we owe it to the memory of those children and to their bereaved parents to learn the lessons from this terrible incident and to take steps to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so, in that spirit, I welcome and support the inquiry announced yesterday. I asked the Home Secretary to confirm that it will be placed on a statutory footing as soon as possible to ensure its independence and also to enable it to compel disclosure of the evidence which it may need. It is vital to get to the truth about what opportunities may have existed to stop the evil perpetrator, Axel Radicalization, from committing these sickening murders. Radicalization was encountered multiple times, as the Home Secretary said, by the police, social services, the school system and the Prevent programme over a period of several years. The inquiry will find out, I hope, whether mistakes were made or whether the law needs to change. And the Home Secretary mentioned some areas that will rightly be looked at, and I support that. I hope the Home Secretary can also confirm this will include consideration of whether the Mental Health Act was adequate for this case. The Home Secretary has also rightly referred to Prevent. A review of Prevent was conducted by William Shawcross, and the last government responded in February 2024. Will the Home Secretary now commit to implementing all of the recommendations of the Shawcross review? Let me now turn to what happened after the murders and to the importance of openness and transparency. Firstly, and this is a very serious and important question, will the Home Secretary confirm that the inquiry will also cover the government, police and CPS response to the murders, and especially the handling of public communications and the appalling riots that followed? It's a very important question. I would be grateful if the Home Secretary would directly answer that in her response. Now, the Prime Minister this morning acknowledged that he knew about the background to the case and to radicalization himself, including the fact that he had been referred to Prevent on 3 separate occasions, and that radicalization had been found to be in possession of ricin, a highly toxic chemical, and a manual detailing al-Qaeda terrorist methods, itself an offence under the Terrorism Act. The Prime Minister also said this morning that he did not disclose any of this to the public in the days and weeks after the murders for fear of prejudicing the subsequent murder trial. And it is, of course, important for journalists and for politicians, and indeed this House, to do nothing that might prejudice a trial. But David Hall, KC, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, said this on the Today programme in the context of this case in October, and it bears quoting in full. Jonathan Hall said this: "The government has to be aware that if there is an information gap, then other voices, particularly on social media, will fill that gap." He went on, "If there is any information you can give, put it in the public domain and be really careful you don't fall into the trap of saying, we can say zilch because there are criminal proceedings. Quite often," he said, "there is a fair amount that can be put into the public domain." Jonathan Hall concluded by saying, "The police now realise that just saying there is a charge, we can't say any more, is not going to cut it these days." So the independent reviewer is saying that the government and police can put some material into the public domain without prejudicing subsequent trials. And in fact, on October the 29th, radicalization was charged with possessing the ricin and the terror manual. That was then made public. So if it can be made public in October without risking prejudice of the murder trial, it follows that it could have been made public in August without prejudicing that same trial. Background facts on other cases over the years have been made public after arrest and before trial without prejudice, and the shields relating to 2 of those cases are in this chamber. So why did the Prime Minister not make public some of this background information in August when he knew it, when later disclosure of that information in October demonstrated such disclosure could be made without prejudice? And why did the Deputy Prime Minister on July the 31st dismiss as, and I quote, fake news, those saying there may be further facts to come out? Let me just briefly, Mr. Speaker, before concluding, explain why this is important. As Jonathan Hall said, if there is a void, then misinformation, especially online, can fill that void. And this appears to be what happened here. And some of that information, it is said, originated overseas from hostile states. It is possible, indeed it is even likely, that this misinformation that was put into the void fuelled the totally unacceptable riots we then subsequently saw. So, will the Home Secretary accept, given what I've just said and what Jonathan Hall said, does she accept there should and could have been more openness and transparency, as I just set out, without prejudicing the trial, and that disclosing more of that truth openly and transparently would have helped combat the damaging misinformation that circulated and which arguably fuelled the riots? Will she confirm the inquiry will look at that aspect of events? Mr. Speaker, this was an appalling tragedy. Young girls murdered with their whole lives ahead of them. Let us all learn the lessons from this tragedy in honour of their memory.
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Shadow Home Secretary raised a series of points, which is obviously a substantial shift in position for him and his party from the position they have taken in government. He asked about whether the status of the inquiry. I can confirm it's going to start quickly on a non-statutory basis in the same way that the Angelini inquiry did, but I can confirm it will be given whatever powers it needs, including on a statutory basis, so that it can get any information that it needs. He referred to the Shawcross review. I can confirm that the government has implemented 33 out of the 34 recommendations, but I would just gently point out to him that actually the approach that the Shawcross review took was to say that the Prevent programme should be narrowed and should actually just focus particularly on the cases around terrorism, and in fact could have put at risk, actually including less cases like this where ideology is less clear. He then raises the issue about the information that was provided, and he will know that the Contempt of Court Act was set out in 1981. The Jonathan Hall has indeed highlighted the problem of disinformation online, social media actors who are not bound by the same rules that the police, the media and the government follow. And he refers, for example, to the name and the nationality being provided, which in practice they were in this case, after misinformation appeared online. But ultimately, he has also said all of this is governed by the Contempt of Court Act 1981, and the Law Commission is reviewing that. But it is not for the government to ignore the law or the advice that we are given when justice for families is at stake. And let me point out to him that the previous Conservative government did not publish information before the trial about the Prevent referral for the perpetrator who killed Sir David Amis. None of us criticised them for that because none of us wanted to put at risk justice for Sir David's family. Nor did they publish information before the trial on the Prevent referral of the asylum seeker who killed Tom Roberts. In fact, they didn't even publish that after the trial. It only came out in the inquest. And the minister, who even after the trial refused to answer my questions on whether they knew that he was wanted for murdering 2 people in Serbia when he was allowed to enter the country, was the current Shadow Justice Secretary. Now, we have been keen to publish the information on Prevent referrals from the start, but throughout, the advice to us has been clear. And if we had ignored the advice that we were given from about the case that put towards us and about the information that the police and the CPS were working through in order to get justice, and if as a result a killer had walked free, no one would ever have forgiven the government or anyone else. The most important thing is to get justice, and then once justice is secured, to make sure at this point the